Russian-Belarusian exercises Zaped 2025 will take place in Belarus as early as September. Although formally defensive in nature, they are of concern to the socialites of NATO countries, including Poland. We will talk about it with General Stanislaw Kozier about the threat and Poland's preparations. Good morning. Good morning to you.
Dzień dobry Państwu.
How do you think all these exercises should be understood from a military point of view, Zaped 2025? Is it such a formal part of the Russian strategy of pressure against NATO? Zaped 2025 exercise is one in a series of such exercises Russia is conducting.
Są jednym z całej serii tego typu ćwiczeń, jakie Rosja prowadzi.
These are mainly exercises to verify or test, to check the actual operational plans that are prepared in preparation for war.
Sprawdzenie rzeczywistych planów operacyjnych, które są przygotowywane na czas wojny.
This is the role of exercises in all countries. This type of strategic exercises, this is what they primarily serve. Therefore, it is very important to observe, monitor, analyze this exercise well, because it is possible to draw conclusions from it as to what are the real, viable operational plans of this exerciser, in this case, Russia.
Realne plany operacyjne tego ćwiczącego, w tym przypadku Rosji.
These Zaped exercises, as the name implies by the way, are about the Western strategic direction for Russia.
Dla Rosji zachodniego kierunku strategicznego.
So in general, the North Atlantic Alliance and Ukraine lie in this Western direction, the great Russian strategic direction. Therefore, these exercises could be about either preparations or plans, concept of war with the North Atlantic Alliance, or perhaps war or some subsequent operations, change of war, and so on with Ukraine.
Albo też być może wojny, czy jakichś kolejnych operacji, zmiany wojny i tak dalej z Ukrainą.
So these two elements we must take into account when evaluating this exercise. What is important, of course, is not only the exercise itself once it is carried out, but also what happens informatively around the exercise. This is because Russia realizes that the West, which is observing these exercises, just wants to know something real about Russian plans. Therefore, it can be assumed in advance that he is simultaneously trying to manipulate informationally this exercise, confuse, mislead, suggest some misinterpretations, and so on. And that's certainly what we're probably dealing with in relation to this year's exercise because we're hearing different information about it. And the fact that it was to take place right on the border with Poland. And it's now that it's shifted the main points of this exercise more to the east, towards perhaps there closer to this main focus of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And therefore, we cannot take so literally all this information we have about the exercise. We must not allow ourselves to be misled, but at the same time observe very carefully the preparation and conduct of this exercise. Poland also said that it sort of announced its own exercise in September. And what do you think? Do they have such a real deterrent value, or is it more about such a more symbolic one here? Exercises, this type of especially large strategic exercises with the involvement of high staff levels, both on the Russian side and on the NATO side, are a certain element of this mutual deterrence, containment, mitigation under the conditions of confrontation that exist between Russia and the West. This confrontation, which in fact today is already the second Cold War between Russia and the West.
W warunkach konfrontacji, jaka istnieje między Rosją i Zachodem, tej konfrontacji, która tak naprawdę dzisiaj jest już drugą zimną wojną między Rosją i Zachodem.
This hot war, if you will, the hot war in
Wojna
Ukraine, is a big part of the
niepozwalająca
Cold
wojna
War
w
waged
Ukrainie
against the West.
jest wielkim elementem zimnej wojny prowadzonej z Zachodem.
And in this Cold War, one of the important elements is precisely this type of various exercises.
Elementów są właśnie tego typu różne ćwiczenia.
There are also incidents at the border, for example, especially in the air or at sea. We often hear about them. Russia carries out, organizes such incidents to test, for example, to test how our NATO air defense works, how it reacts, how fast it responds, how fast the planes are picked up, how many, and so on.
Obrona powietrzna, jak reaguje, jak szybko podrywane są samoloty, ile i tak dalej, i tak dalej.
So, this neo-Cold War confrontation between Russia and the West is going on all the time, and this exercise is part of such a confrontation. Therefore, the alliance organizes, it must organize similar ventures to show Russia that it is also prepared to conduct such operations.
Aby pokazywać Rosji, że jest także przygotowany do prowadzenia tego typu operacji.
It can't be that one side, that only Russia is going to flex its muscles, is going to intimidate public opinion right here in the West, whether in Poland or elsewhere. Because this information about such large-scale maneuvers, they make quite an impression on public opinion, cause concern, raise some questions for those in power about whether we are properly prepared, and so on and so forth.
Wywołują zaniepokojenie, wywołują jakieś pytania do rządzących, czy jesteśmy właściwie przygotowani i tak dalej, i tak dalej.
Consequently, we must also respond adequately to the Russian side's exercises, and this is happening.
Ćwiczenia strony rosyjskiej, tak się dzieje.
The North Atlantic Alliance had already been taking a serious look at Russian threats for a decade or so, since the first Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2014, since before 2014.
Zaczął poważnie podchodzić do zagrożeń rosyjskich, bo przed 2014 rokiem
basically, the alliance focused more on missions somewhere. Well, in Afghanistan, for example, we were very heavily involved, and that was what we were mainly concerned with, not the security of our territory. But over the last decade, it's just that NATO has sort of returned to its core mission, and as a result, one of the elements of this ongoing defense policy of the alliance is also these joint exercises that are very often organized in different regions of NATO, and it's in the north, and it's naval exercises, and it's just these kinds of land-based different or air-land, air-sea maneuvers and exercises along the entire eastern flank to show Russia that we also have our plans, that we are also prepared to possibly repel, possibly like the rest.
Manewry i ćwiczenia wzdłuż całej wschodniej flanki, aby pokazać Rosji, że my również mamy swoje plany, że my jesteśmy również przygotowani na odpieranie ewentualnej agresji.
Lithuania and Poland are also preparing an evacuation plan for civilians. How do you think, is Polish society already so psychologically and informationally prepared for crisis situations? For example, such as evacuation, state of emergency, or such real military threats. Prepared, but not to the end. We are in the process. We are actually in the process of building this strategic resilience of the state, society, and individual citizens. This purpose is well served by various undertakings, including, for example, training of the population, training of individual citizens, going out with an offer to these citizens, for example, to come to volunteer, train in various ways, whether very short, 1 day or 1 week, various forms of training, to be able to behave under critical conditions, including war conditions.
Przeszkolenia, aby umieć się zachowywać w warunkach krytycznych, w tym także w warunkach wojennych.
This is a relatively new challenge for our citizens, for our society. This direct threat of war, as I mentioned, it has actually and realistically been taken into account for about a decade, since the time when Russia practically showed a little of its imperial policy, doctrine, with not just some kind of informational scare, but real implementation on the example of the war in Ukraine. And since then, in Poland too, various projects have been prepared to increase our country's resilience to threats.
ale realnej realizacji na przykładzie wojny w Ukrainie i od tamtej pory w Polsce także przygotowywane są różne przedsięwzięcia dla zwiększenia odporności naszego państwa na zagrożenia.
The recently adopted law on civil protection and civil defense in case of emergency, no, at the moment is sort of being dissected into various small executive tasks. Both, for example, investing in the expansion of shelters, so much needed in the event of war. We see this in the example of both the war in Ukraine, how important are various shelters and shelters for civilians, or we have seen it, for example, in recent days in the example of the Iran-Israel war, how, for example, in Israel are well-developed this system of just shelters, where in the event of the announcement of an alarm in principle, people have full shelter too. That's why there are so few civilian casualties after rocket raids, even on places or residential areas. So this is a very important issue, this construction of shelters, but also the formation of just such a defense awareness of society and Poles so that they know how to behave in emergency situations, respond to announced alarms, have access to this type of information, and so on. So we are in the process of building this strategic resilience.
Społeczeństwa i Polaków, aby umieli się zachowywać w sytuacjach zagrożeń, reagować na ogłaszane alarmy, mieć dostęp do tego typu informacji i tak dalej. Więc jesteśmy w trakcie budowania tej odporności strategicznej.
It can't be said that we already have it all built.
Wszystko zbudowane.
Is it possible that Russia and Belarus will learn such scenarios with weapons, with nuclear weapons, also cyber attacks, or will there be more disinformation operations because there are such disinformation operations? Can there be more such operations? As much as possible, as much as possible. Well, it is this Cold War that we are living in. Ukraine is living in a hot war with Russia, but we here in NATO are living in Cold War conditions with Russia, and in the conditions of this Cold War, it is these activities below the threshold of a hot war. We so generically call them now various hybrid activities, which include precisely in particular the completely new space of confrontation that is cyberspace. Compared to that first Cold War of the 20th century, this is a whole new category of threats that we have to deal with and that we are dealing with on a daily basis. Every now and then we hear about various cyber operations, about hacking into information systems, so it's these cyber operations. This sphere of information warfare, which you also ask and mention here, is very important. Psychological such pressure on public opinion, for example, to discourage us from supporting the struggling Ukraine, right? These are specially conducted disinformation operations, assuming to conflate, for example, Poles with Ukrainians, assuming to discourage Poles from supporting Ukraine, because Russia's main concern at the moment has been for a few years since it carried out its aggression against Ukraine. Russia's main concern at the moment is to discourage people in the West as much as possible from supporting Ukraine, because Russia realizes that if the West stopped helping Ukraine alone, left to its own devices, would not stand much of a chance in any further war with Russia.
Gdyby Zachód przestał pomagać Ukrainie, no to Ukraina osamotniona, pozostawiona sama sobie, nie miałaby dużych szans w dalszej wojnie z Rosją.
That's why Russia is trying to make this very thing happen to discourage us here. And this purpose is well served from the Russian point of view by these disinformation operations, in which Russia specializes, by the way, not from today, but for a long time, this type of activity has been well organized. On top of that, there are also those hybrid activities of the nature of, for example, pressure on our border with Belarus. Here we had and have all the time this problem that migration is used instrumentally to create a threat on the border to engage our security potential to protect this border.
rozważania zagrożenia na granicy, do angażowania naszego potencjału bezpieczeństwa do ochrony tej granicy w
Let's
celu
note that a
naszej
sizable portion of our military is
spora część
engaged to
naszego
cover the border
wojska
with
jest
Belarus directly.
zaangażowana do osłony bezpośrednio granicy z Białorusią.
There is a military operation there all the time, strengthening the border guards because of these hybrid threats, migration threats.
Z uwagi na te zagrożenia hybrydowe, zagrożenia migracyjne.
We also have to deal with Russian activity involving espionage operations. From time to time, here various collaborators of Russian services, or we have to deal with the organization of sabotage diversions on our territory.
Chwytujemy tutaj różnych współpracowników rosyjskich służb, czy też mamy do czynienia z organizowaniem dywersji, sabotaży na naszym terytorium.
We have had in the last months or years, even the last two, a series of, for example, fires started by saboteurs recruited by Russian special services from our criminal world to carry out such acts. So these Russian actions, this Russian pressure below in the corner of armed open aggression is very intense, and we, as a frontline state in the Second Cold War, have very serious tasks to perform here that involve our defense capabilities to a greater extent than many countries in the West.
Rosyjskie, ta presja rosyjska poniżej progu zbrojnej, otwartej agresji jest bardzo intensywna i my jako państwo frontowe w tej drugiej zimnej wojnie mamy tutaj do wykonania bardzo poważne zadania, które angażują nasz potencjał obronny w większym stopniu niż wiele państw na Zachodzie.
On the other hand, countries somewhere farther away like Spain are resistant and opposed to this. They don't see the need. We understand more the need to increase defense efforts. For example, at the NATO summit, a decision was made to increase defense spending across the alliance, and as you can see, these countries on the eastern flank, such as Poland, and here our neighbors, are implementing this without problems. So there are some divisions, differences of opinion and opinion within NATO, which Russia is trying to take maximum advantage of by squeezing into these.
Różnice opinii i zdań wewnątrz NATO, które Rosja stara się maksymalnie wykorzystać, wciskając się w te szczeliny różniące poszczególne państwa, aby osłabiać NATO od wewnątrz.
Is the Suwalki Isthmus still such a vulnerable area? And can Zapad 2025 be used here as such a veil for provocation from this side? Yes, I believe that, of course, this real threat concerning the Suwalki Isthmus as well depends to a large extent on what the outcome of the Russian-Ukrainian war will be.
Zależy w dużym stopniu od tego, jaki będzie wynik wojny rosyjsko-ukraińskiej.
If Russia defeated Ukraine, conquered this Ukraine, went all the way to the line of contact with Poland, here on the Bug River all the way to the south as well, that is, it would win Ukraine, and that would mean that not only Ukraine was won, but that the West was also won, because Ukraine can only be defeated if the West gets scared and stops helping it.
Ale że zwyciężyła także Zachód, bo Ukraina może być pokonana tylko wtedy, jeśli Zachód się wystraszy i przestanie jej pomagać.
If frightened by Russian blackmail with, for example, the threat of tactical nuclear weapons, which Russia often invokes to blackmail and frighten our public here. So if Russia defeated Ukraine, which would mean that the West also lost this Cold War battle with Russia, then Russia's next target after some time, after sort of licking those wounds of its in the Ukrainian war, because after all, it is suffering heavy losses there. Immediately after the Ukrainian war, it would be unlikely to be able to attack or provoke another war, but after some time it would perhaps be ready to try to achieve its next goal here in the north, which would then be for Russia to forge a land corridor to the Königsberg region to Kaliningrad.
Byłoby wtedy dla Rosji wybicie sobie lądowego korytarza do obwodu królewieckiego, do Kaliningradu.
Just as one of Russia's important goals there in the south, after all, was to carve out a land bridge to Crimea for itself after the 2014 aggression, for almost a full decade Russia has been devising how to carve out this land bridge corridor to Crimea for itself here.
Dekadę Rosja obmyślywała, jak sobie tutaj wybić ten korytarz, pomost lądowy na Krym.
It carried out the aggression against Ukraine in 2022, presumably largely with this very goal in mind. So here in the north is a similar little situation today. The Kaliningrad region is something like Crimea was when Russia conquered it in 2014 and was isolated Crimea from all of Russia's strategic territory. That's how Kaliningrad is today. Therefore, it seems, at least it is my assessment, that if Russia defeated Ukraine, its next such strategic goal would not be a large-scale, full-scale war with NATO, because here I think Russia's chances would not be great to defeat the entire North Atlantic Alliance, but an attempt at such a lightning-fast operation on precisely the area in the Suwałki Isthmus region to connect the Kaliningrad region with Belarus, and with the entire then strategic territory of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine after conquering Ukraine,
błyskawicznej operacji na właśnie w obszarze, w rejonie przesmyku suwalskiego, aby połączyć obwód kaliningradzki z Białorusią i z całym swoim wtedy terytorium strategicznym Rosja, Białoruś, Ukraina po podbiciu Ukrainy.
Russia could decide to take such a step to start scaring NATO with tactical nuclear weapons after controlling this corridor. That good, let's finish already negotiating peace here to end this conflict, because we are determined to use tactical nuclear weapons by performing, for example, some warning strike with tactical nuclear weapons somewhere in the air over the sea, not necessarily to attack some forces on it, but to give such a signal to the division of the alliance as to what to do next with this war.
Zaatakować jakieś siły NATO, ale aby dać sygnał taki do podziału sojuszu co do decyzji, co dalej z tą wojną robić.
So, the risk of this type of war, such a limited war against NATO, which Poland could also suffer, would be huge after if Russia wins the war in Ukraine.
Byłoby ogromne w razie wygrania przez Rosję.
On the other hand, if Ukraine defends itself, if Russia does not win the war in Ukraine, well, this kind of risk of action against NATO would definitely decrease. So the fate of the war in Ukraine is very important for our security here in the West. Exactly what other signals is Russia now sending to Poland and the West in general through all these maneuvers? And is it generally such a real attempt to change the security rules in the region, or is it rather not? Or is this more of a game on Russia's part? For today, it is obviously a strategic game, so to speak, such a hybrid pressure. This is simply an element of very hybrid pressure, which for today, over this immediate period, as long as Russia is forced to wage war against Ukraine, the main purpose of all these operations performed by Russia against the West, including Poland, is precisely to refer to the war in Ukraine. There is the discouragement of the West, such intimidation of public opinion, the blackmailing of public opinion with some terrible things that might happen if the West continues to help Ukraine, so that this public opinion forces the authorities of Western countries, NATO countries, withholding, for example, aid, So far as we can see, this Russian operation is not effective. However, the West, especially I am talking about Europe, the European countries, are determined to help Ukraine. This was shown, for example, by the meetings, talks, and decisions of individual European countries at the NATO summit in The Hague, where the commitment of the Allies was emphasized, further support for Ukraine.
Gdzie podkreślono zaangażowanie sojuszników w dalsze wspieranie Ukrainy.
So this Russian hybrid pressure, for the time being, is not effective. There is, of course, some risk associated with U.S. global policy in this regard, because the United States, as a global power, has, as we know, interests not only here in the region of Europe, which concerns us most, but has its strategic interests in other regions, especially in the Indo-Pacific. There is China, or in the Middle East, has recently demonstrated such very serious involvement after all U.S. strikes on Iran.
Pokazało takie bardzo poważne zaangażowanie przecież amerykańskie w uderzenia na Iran.
As a result, the United States must somehow divide its strategic attention between different regions of the world, and as a result, its direct involvement in supporting Ukraine sort of is less than we would like, and certainly less much than Ukraine itself would like.
Jest mniejsze niż my byśmy chcieli, a na pewno mniejsze dużo niż chciałaby sama Ukraina.
Therefore, the burden of supporting Ukraine necessarily shifts more to European countries, and for the time being, these European countries are giving evidence that they are taking up this task, taking up this challenge of reducing American involvement in order to fill this assurance gap with their efforts.
Zmniejszenia zaangażowania amerykańskiego, aby tę lukę zapełnić swoim wysiłkiem.
That's why Russia has recently focused its hybrid pressure, its information, diplomatic disinformation, cyber, and all kinds of other focused strategic attention on Europe, not on the United States. As it was until recently, it was the United States that was in Russian doctrine, in Russian plans, in Russian concepts, and Russian policy.
Było jeszcze niedawno, to Stany Zjednoczone były w doktrynie rosyjskiej, w planach rosyjskich, w koncepcjach, w polityce rosyjskiej.
The United States was that main adversary of Russia, and Europe was that auxiliary helper of such Americans in this regard. It is today that the entire Russian strategy is mainly focused on European countries, because they are the focus of support for Ukraine. And it is a huge challenge for us here in Europe to properly organize ourselves to counter this Russian pressure so that we do not succumb to it, and support Ukraine so that Russia cannot defeat it. And then, in your opinion, what such should be Poland's priorities now and in general in the coming months, let's say, both in military and civilian terms, of course? No military priorities are defined in our security strategy. At the moment, work is underway on our new national security strategy. Hopefully it will be released soon, and these priorities will be clearly defined there, but they have been sort of known for a long time. Our most important task today is to strengthen our own defense capabilities. Strengthening the armed forces by improving them, purchasing new equipment, replacing that which we have, after all, transferred a very large part of our own armaments to Ukraine. Now we need to quickly replenish these weapons with purchases, and we are doing that, strengthening the armed forces. The second issue, the second priority, is our external alliances, especially the North Atlantic Alliance, which is here such a major external pillar supporting our security. We are very keen on maintaining the cohesion and unity of NATO, unity between Europe and the United States. Because it is known that without the United States, the existence of the alliance would lose its sense. It would have to create a completely new defense structure of some kind. So we are very concerned that NATO is coherent, that NATO is determined, that NATO is interested in the security of the eastern flank, and all our defense diplomacy, military diplomacy, but this diplomacy, also classical, broadly understood political and economic and all sorts, is aimed at not to save the North Atlantic Alliance from the various risks it now faces in connection with precisely this Russian pressure on the one hand, and on the other hand from the challenges of the new American policy, which, especially under the direction of President Trump, it reveals itself precisely by shifting both priorities and methods of conducting this policy. I z drugiej strony przed wyzwaniami nowej polityki amerykańskiej, która zwłaszcza pod kierunkiem prezydenta Trumpa, ona się wyjawnia właśnie
przenoszeniem zarówno priorytetów, jak i metod prowadzenia tej polityki.
Under these conditions, we must be concerned and strive to work out new formulas to strengthen the North Atlantic Alliance. For example, by European countries taking more and more responsibility for the functioning of NATO, for the tasks carried out by NATO.
Coraz większej odpowiedzialności za funkcjonowanie NATO, za zadania realizowane przez NATO.
We can say that we care about this, about the Europeanization of the North Atlantic Alliance, because up to now the North Atlantic Alliance has been, as we can figuratively say. It used to be that when the first bicycles appeared, the lady can see them somewhere in the pictures, such a big one wheel, and the other tiny, such a support. That's what it looked like until now, that the United States was the big wheel in the bicycle. In the old school bicycle, it was the big wheel, and Europe was the tiny wheel. At the moment, NATO needs to become a normal bicycle with two wheels equally working this American wheel and the European wheel. This is what we care about, so that the North Atlantic Alliance is just such a two-part, well-cooperating mechanism. Well, and the third thing is the European Union. For us, also very important is the external structure that supports our security, especially in the area of capacity building, the defense industry, cooperation precisely in the field of defense industries, defense outlays, expansion of defense infrastructure on our territory, and so on. So these main priorities are our own capacity, NATO effective, and strengthening relations with the European Union.
NATO skuteczne I wzmacnianie relacji z Unią Europejską.
Of course, we need to encapsulate all this with good relations with our neighbors as well. I am referring here to both Ukraine and other countries on the eastern flank. Especially important is our good cooperation and good relations with Ukraine. Not only now during the war when Ukraine needs our help and our support, but also after the war when hopefully Ukraine will build its statehood so that it can join our Western structures. We are a huge supporter of Ukraine's membership in NATO and the European Union, because it is a guarantee that Ukraine's membership in these Western structures is a guarantee that Russia will no longer decide to attack Ukraine, at least as easily as it did in 2014 and 2022. And the border of this security zone will be somewhere beyond the Dnieper, not on the Bug directly, should Ukraine, God forbid, lose the war. So our relationship, our support for Ukraine, is a very important element of such a perspective, such a finality of our national security as well. Very serious years are yet to come, and a great deal of work. I thank you sincerely for the conversation and also remind you that the guest of our conversation was General, former head of the National Security Bureau, Stanislaw Kozier. Thank you very much for the interview. Goodbye. Thank you. Goodbye.